Hey, Kras, how's it going?
Hey, how you doing?
Doing good, man. I really appreciate you doing this interview. It's great to have you on the show.
Absolutely,
Real honor. Um,
absolutely.
I've,
Thanks for the support.
yeah, man. I'm really excited to hear the new album. I mean, by the time this airs, the whole album will be out, but you've got most of
Great,
the tracks out already, and I've really been loving listening to them. Why don't you
thanks.
start out by telling the listeners just what they need to look out for, and kind of how you got started on making this new album called Always.
Yeah, so the new album Always just came out. I made it really like during the pandemic. Got to link up with a producer named Otis McDonald, who we kind of met on Instagram on social media, and initially worked together on a project called Song Aid, which is a organization that kind of raises money for charities. He was like, well, why don't we try to do something where you send me, some vocals and guitar, and I'll add some drums, and we'll kind of do it virtual, because at the time everyone was at home.
Yeah.
So we did this Dylan song, "Man and Me," for the compilation he was working on, and I was so blown away with what he did. I just like basically sent him some guitar and like some rhythm, like percussion or something, and vocal, and he sent me back like this beautifully produced track. So I was like, man, let's do some more. And the first track we did was called Silence, first original song. And then I just started writing, and had some demos of some old songs that I kind of dug up. But we were kind of just off to the races from there. And we did most of the records, sending stuff back and forth between our studios. And then finally, I got to go to his studio up in San Francisco to kind of finish up mixing and adding a few things. But it just kind of flowed, and the inspiration for a lot of the songs was kind of drawn from being at home. I had just gotten married, and my wife was pregnant right when the pandemic hit. So I had a lot of changes going on in my life, and you can hear a lot of that in the songs.
So is
So
a lot of the album focused around your marriage and your relationship with your wife?
yeah, I would say like about half of it. I mean, it was definitely what I was going through at the time. There's some songs that were older, "Silent," "So Cold," "Leave Me Alone" were like older songs that I kind of dug up um,
Yeah, that was
to
going to be my
work on.
next question was to ask, if it was a lot of current things or if a lot of this is feelings that you've been going through for a while. Uh,
Yeah, you can definitely tell. Like "Always with You" was definitely one that was like current for with what and then "Alone Together," "Hold Tight," "Where I Belong" was kind of written as I was moving to California. I also moved to California about a year before the pandemic hit,
yeah.
so that one was kind of recent. And yeah, but then a few of them were older songs that I had like messed around with but never finished. So once I had some time on my hands, I was like, okay, let me revisit some of these older songs and actually finish them.
No, I love the your producer's like what he got out of your guitar sound. Is that more of his treatment of your playing, or do you have any like go-to opinions that certain things you like to apply stylistically to your playing?
A lot of the guitar stuff, I tracked all the guitar in my studio here.
Yeah.
So he added a little bit, but a lot of that was definitely, kind of how I was playing and how I was treating the guitar as I was recording it. So, yeah, I mean, part of what kind of kicked in after doing the first song is when I did "Man and Me" in Silence, I kind of started harmonizing my own solos a little bit, which was something that you hear a lot with like the Allman Brothers. You hear with certain artists, but not so much in like soul or music.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just kind of did it on a whim, on "Man and Me," and I kind of liked it. So it kind of shaped how I played guitar in a lot of the other songs. Was playing a little bit more lyrically and melodically with more melody and more space to it so that I could go back and harmonize it, which I've always loved the sound of two guitars playing, melody and harmony together. So you hear a lot of that on the record. And then live, my guitarist that plays with me, James, has really done a great job of like not only learning those parts but kind of embellishing them, and we do a lot of cool like double guitar stuff in the live show, which
Yeah,
has been fun.
yeah. I mean, the solos sound fantastic as ever. I mean, I love your lead playing. I'm a big rhythm guitar nerd, and even a lot of the tones you were getting out of that stuff really like completed the tracks in a subtle way. I mean, I don't know what it is between you and your producer's work, but I mean, the whole album has a really unique vibe that I think is a cool shift from your last work. But I feel like as a
Thank you.
producer, you've always been doing that. You work in a lot of styles. Like you kind of know how to put your fingerprint on stuff. When you're writing guitar parts, do you have like a do you lean towards lead over rhythm playing, or are they both about equally as important to you?
I guess they're both important. I usually more think more about the rhythm parts initially when I'm writing the song, and then once the song's kind of completed, I'm like, or close to complete, I'll be like, okay, where can I fit in some lead stuff? It's usually kind of an organic thing. It's like, oh, okay, after the bridge, I'll open it up and let the guitar kind of shine there or lead there. So
Yeah,
yeah, initially it's for me it's about like vocal melody and like chords and guitar parts initially. But I always, I love lead guitar.
yeah,
It's just usually it's kind of like the last thing that happens.
yeah. I mean, I had a feeling it was somewhere in the middle, but I know you were originally a bass player, so I
Yeah,
figured there was some like affinity there for just having a really fleshed out rhythm part and have that like melodically drive the song in its own way. Um,
yeah, yeah,
and I know I've heard you say in other interviews that a lot of like early guitar stuff you were working on was like Led Zeppelin, right? For example.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
definitely.
would that stuff did that get you more into the lead playing, or what was the
Well,
playing on
I
those
guess
records? Was there also
yeah,
some rhythm
that
influence from the rock side of things when you were getting into that?
for sure, for sure. I mean, when I was a kid, those the first records I really kind of got obsessed with were like Led Zeppelin and Hendrix. Then eventually Stevie Ray Vaughan as I became a guitarist. I got really into Stevie Ray.
Yeah,
But before I even played like those records and that lead thing was always what I kind of wanted to do, but it took a while till I could figure out how to do it.
yeah,
So, I would figure out the basic chords and structures first, but I always like wanted to be able to kind of sing with the guitar. That was the thing that I loved was like that soaring, like soulful sound. I also was really into BB King.
yeah,
And once I figured out Hendrix, once I found Hendrix, I kind of started digging back into what influenced him, like Albert King and a lot of the early like blues guys,
yeah.
that obviously influenced Hendrix, but also influenced the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and all that.
Well, I feel like a lot of places that music has gone in recent years can be traced back to the blues. I mean, among many other early genres, I feel like the blues is one that kind of just permeates a lot of different things. Things that aren't necessarily called blues that have it in them. Do you have a particular favorite, like, thing that comes from blues that isn't quite that? Like for me, I'm a really big fan of Johnny Guitar Watson's like funkier
Oh
blues
yeah,
phase, like "Real
yeah, I
Mother
love
for
that.
You," or like Frank Zappa's sort of blues type of songs, like "Cosmic Debris" or "Dickie's Such an A-hole," stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, there's so much. I mean, I feel like every genre kind of that I listen to has blues in it. Just from what you were talking about, I don't know if you've ever heard of Little Beaver, but he was
No, I
like
haven't.
played. He's new. I'm pretty sure he's from New Orleans, but it's like some soul funk. He's got this track called "Party Down" that kind of like has this. He's like blues, but it has like some jazzy chords in there.
Yeah,
That was my other thing. It was like once I like kind of discovered George Benson,
yeah,
who obviously came up as a jazz player, but then he sang so like soulful, and his stuff really comes from the blues, but it has like this harmony to it that makes it extra like interesting. So I always, and Grant Green's another guy, like Grant Green,
Yeah.
doing like the soul jazz kind of thing. But I mean, it's really based in the blues, but then they kind of have these other colors that they add in there, which are, I guess, what you would kind of draw from like jazz chords and stuff like that.
Yeah. Um, Now, as far as going back to the bass playing, I'm a bass player. I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about your thoughts on bass playing because my favorite bassist of all time is Paul Jackson, and I know
Oh, me too.
you're a big
Yep.
Paul Jackson nerd.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you remember when you like first heard his playing? Was it on a Herbie
Yeah,
heavy
definitely
detector?
was Herbie. I think it probably Palm Grease was like the one where I like was like, who is that? You know?
Yep, that's the one
And
that the first line that I learned that got me hooked on
yeah,
him.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's my favorite stuff. I feel like all the bass players I love are their favorite bass player is Paul Jackson. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like Pino, O'Teal, a lot of the bass players that I love all like will nerd out on Paul Jackson. He's kind of like, the BB King of bass. Like everyone listens to BB King that I love on guitar,
yeah,
or Hendrix. But yeah, Paul Jackson's that guy. He just really didn't. He's not a household name in the same way as those guys are.
yeah. Were you listening to him like at the time where you were playing a lot of bass, or did that come later?
Yeah, I mean, well, when I first started, it was really I wasn't able to play any of that stuff, but I kind of like played bass and guitar equally for a very long time. So like I started out on bass because my brother played guitar, so it just kind of made sense to have another bass player in our household. My dad got me a bass, but pretty soon after I started playing guitar on his guitars, and eventually had my own guitar. But Yeah, I would say like in the high school years, later high school years when I met the Lettuce guys, I met them in the middle of high school, summer of sophomore year. I went to a Berkeley 5-week program thing in the summer where a
Yeah,
bunch of kids go. And anyway, I remember being there and just like us all sitting in the dorm room and listening to Herbie Thrust and Manchild and those records just over and over and over. And I would learn the bass parts to like all that stuff.
yeah.
And the guitar parts, really. Wah Wah Watson was also like kind of one of my heroes. And
He,
so, yeah.
yeah, he's one of my favorite rhythm guitarists. That era of records is some of my favorite records of all time. I mean, the only one above Thrust for me is Secrets.
Yeah, I
Like
love Secrets too.
all those bass lines are so like
Oh, man,
masterful.
so good. Spider.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite
Yeah, it's
bass
so
line
good.
of all time. Yeah,
That's my stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I always love to keep bringing him up because I always felt like he wasn't talked about as much as I like to hear him, and I was, we
Yeah.
lost him this past year, and
Yeah.
I was when I was listening to your interviews, hearing you talk about him a little bit, I was excited. Like I said, he's definitely my favorite. Um, what would you say if someone had to pick a song as like the song that demonstrates like his little characteristics the best? Because I can't think of like what's a bass line you
Yeah.
would say he's doing all of the little things that
There's
make Paul Jackson lines Paul
Well,
Jackson
I
lines.
think like that's the thing about him is he's so like heavy-handed. Like it's him off right away.
Yeah.
Because he's got the do 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 do.
Yep.
Like that's like his riff. Is like he played, but what he does with like the pentatonic, because it's all pentatonic for the most part, but it's like so unique to his vibe. I mean, I think Palm Grease is a good example because it like starts with him, with that, and
Yeah.
it's so him. And like I got to work with him a couple times, and one of the times, we were talking about the different bass lines because he wasn't ever playing the same bass line from the record, and one of
Yeah.
his, and we were like, hey, isn't it like go to the, like at one point, Bill Summers. They were doing like a Headhunters kind of reunion thing, but without Herbie. But I got to play the gig, and Bill Summers was like, "Hey man, Paul, doesn't it go like this?" I forget which song, and he was like, "Well, I don't know, man. I made it up then. I'll make it up again." And that was
Yeah.
like his. He was like all of that stuff. I was kind of just making it up as we went, and I was just so blown away by that because those bass lines are so iconic to me.
Yeah, I remember reading in Herbie's autobiography, he was saying how Paul like was this mixture of jazz and funk and didn't like to repeat himself. Even though
Yeah.
I feel like he's got that half of like keeping an ostinato going for half the phrase, then the other half of the phrase he's kind of just like lyrically doing fills. I don't know what to call it, but he's doing a lot of that like high up stuff, like you said, pentatonic, like 5-4-3, bending the 4, bending the 9, things like that is what I think of when I think of his playing. But I mean, it's so cool that you got to work with him and the other Headhunters guys. Like one of my favorite groups of musicians together. I know you also have said that you've done a show with Questlove and Bill Summers together as a rhythm section.
We actually kind of had a band, but we only did like 2 or 3 gigs. It was called The Concept, and it was Bill Summers and George Porter on bass. Actually,
oh, that's right. Yeah, you said that too. Yeah,
and Questlove, and then Ivan Neville did one of the gigs. Casey Benjamin did one of the gigs, but it was like kind of a mixture of Meters and Headhunters, which are like 2 of my favorite bands.
Yeah.
So that was really fun.
Do you feel like when those kind of players are getting together, I mean, like a player like Questlove, for example, does he try to play that kind of stuff from the record, or is he putting his own spin on those songs?
Well, I think what makes Questlove so great is he always knows the record, but also can't help but add his thing to it,
Yeah.
So he was very aware of the records, and he knew the beats, but he was definitely like adding his stuff to it. But it was a perfect blend, in my opinion, of paying respect to the original recording, but also giving it his own thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting too tempted to jump from thing to thing. You're bringing up so many musicians that I love to talk about. But I guess while on the topic of Questlove, I would consider him like one of those encyclopedic, like master historians, in like music that we have right now. Is there anyone else that you think of, like when you have a question about music or you really want to get into a deep discussion, learn something new? Is there anyone else that you think of as the go-to, like encyclopedic knowledge of music?
Well, that's a great question. When I've gotten to spend time with John Scofield, asking him, I always try to get some cool stories from him, whether it's like the later Miles Davis stuff or, his early days of, playing with Dennis Chambers and that whole crew. I've been so lucky to get to work with great people. And, I'm not shy about asking, being a fanboy,
Yeah.
when the time is right, of course. So yeah, it's, I feel like I have a podcast called Plus One, Eric Krasno Plus One, and I pretty much just do that the whole time.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next segue, was into talking about, being an interviewer, because, it's something I'm relatively new at, and it's, that it's definitely not as prevalent to me as music is in my life, but it's still like an art form that I appreciate and want to learn to do my best at. I mean, were you doing any sort of broadcast or any like speaking based work before your podcast, or is that a whole new thing for you?
A little bit. I had a radio show that really wasn't even a regular thing. I kind of would just go into Sirius XM every once in a while. My buddy Ari Fink kind of ran the 23, the Jam On channel.
Yeah.
So I came in and did a bunch of shows there, and would kind of pick a playlist, interview some people, talk on the show. But the problem was they weren't, and no shade to them there, I love them, but they weren't really, their format wasn't based on talking. So a lot of my interviews would have to get chopped up into these little snippets, and I wanted to do a more of a long form thing. And at that time, podcasts had just kind of started being a thing.
Yeah.
So I kind of was like, it should be a podcast, but it took a while to get it going. So a few years later, it was actually like right when the pandemic hit. I had just recorded, like the February of 2020, I started recording the podcast, and then like a month later, the world shut down. Initially, the idea was to do video, and I did video, like Marcus King and Mac Ayres and a few of the first interviews I did were video interviews where they'd come to my studio, we'd like play a song, we'd video. But then when things shut down, I was like, okay, there's this thing called Zoom. It's like now everybody's like Zoom all day, every day. At the time, it was a new thing, and so I started doing the interviews via Zoom, and it ended up being a blessing in disguise, because all of the artists that would have been a lot harder to get during like touring season were home and bored.
Yeah.
So within the first week, I got I had actually a pre-recorded show with John Mayer, so he was one of the first, but I had Dave Matthews and Krungbin and Ziggy Marley, and got some really great artists to do it. And yeah, it just kind of like took off from there. I've done like 77 episodes or something. And it's been just like a fun side project that kind of became a little more than that during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean the number of people you've like heavyweight people you've talked to is amazing. I definitely recommend the podcast just for all the interesting talks. Like I was just listening to the Nate Smith interview.
I
was
love
loving
him.
it today.
Yeah.
I'm a big
really
fan of
smart
his.
guy and such a great musician.
Yeah, I mean it's going through. I had listened to some like last year some of the episodes, and seeing all the stuff that I had missed out on. I mean, there's some that I'm going back to listen to because you've really had a lot of people that I love a lot. But it's, I mean, when you're going to interview people, did it take when you first started the show, did it feel like you had to take a bit of time to get into a rhythm, or does it feel just as natural as like hanging in the green room and talking with the musicians?
That's a good question. I think I got better at it the more I did it. But the nature of the show really is supposed to be kind of a candid conversation.
Yeah.
I would say there, what really was a learning curve was just feeling out how different people conduct their interviews, because some people are really great at just going on, and like Don was, I'd say, hey man, and then he would just talk for hours, and he knew the talking points I wanted to hear before I didn't have to pull him into there. He knew I wanted to hear about the Stones and Bonnie Raitt and Dylan, and I didn't have to coax him into that. Same with Questlove, but then other people, they are just waiting for me, and I have to really guide the conversation. And the other thing is that a lot of them were my good friends, but as the thing took off, we started reaching out beyond like my inner circle of friends, and in those cases I had to do research. I mean, I did research on all of them, to be honest, but I think like Bela Fleck, who I am friends with, but I don't know him that well, but he's such a respected musician with such a history, and I remember being pretty nervous and having to do a lot of research, and I watched like his documentary and read every article I could on him, and because he's had so many different points in his career.
Yeah.
So and same, I mean, even with Schofield, like, who's a friend, it's like, it's good to know your history. And I appreciate that you have obviously done all your homework here, because sometimes I've done so many interviews in the past where people don't know, and it's always feels better when people have like at least know what you're up to, and what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's nice to talk with someone else who does it, because like I said, it is its own art form, and I can't pretend to be like the same caliber of interviewer as someone who just does that, who just makes that their their skill
Yeah,
set, but I
yeah.
feel like even coming from music, there's a lot that you can relate to and a lot that you can kind of build on when it comes to like developing interviewing as a skill. I
Yeah.
mean, do you have any like have there been any realizations you've had that make it a lot easier for you to like come up with questions, or when you're doing your research, you have like a go-to method you like to use to try to like find something new about somebody?
I think it's different with each person. So I think going with your gut really is what you got to do. I think, in certain cases, if you got to be prepared to lead the conversation,
Yeah.
like if someone's not talking, or they're really quiet, and yeah, like you have to be able to lead them into something that they're going to be excited to talk about. You got to read the room. You got to
Yeah.
know, like if you're going into a territory that that they're uncomfortable with, know how to veer out of that and get into something good.
Yeah.
Because every artist wants to talk about what they're doing right now. And I think so. It's also important to like lead with that, and is like, okay, let's talk about what you're doing right now, and
Yeah.
then getting into the things that led up to that, which are maybe what you want to hear more about, will come more naturally.
Yeah. Um, Now, do you, when it comes to like trying to push towards those sort of like things that you want to know or the deeper questions, do you feel like you have any memorable questions where you're like, I'm proud that I came up with that I was able to get like this out of that interview, and I think it's
Well, one that I was very nervous about, and I guess it's not a specific question that I asked, but I was pretty nervous about talking to Ziggy Marley, even though I've
yeah,
worked with him and he's a really sweet guy. I just like was so afraid that everyone on earth just wants to talk about his dad, and talk
yeah,
about what it was like being around his dad and being in, around the band, and when we got to that point, I made a point of like really talking about him because he has a great career in his own right, has done amazing things himself. He's a philanthropist and all this stuff. So once we got through a lot of that, I was nervous, but I had to get into like, okay, so what was it like growing up Bob Marley's son? He's like, everybody's got to ask that. It's like
yeah,
you have to. That's it. And of course, he like delved into like really cool stories about growing up in Jamaica and being around him and being on stage with him, during like I think it's the One Love concert, whatever the concert where they like brought the two like opposing leaders together, like historic moments
yeah,
that changed the world, And luckily he was like down to talk about that, and it was cool. But I was like nervous to go there initially.
yeah. I mean, I feel like um, people obviously like respect when you go out of your way to ask questions that aren't common, but I also feel like I've had guests appreciate when you're willing to go somewhere that's a little uncomfortable. I don't know.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
feel like it's hard to figure out like what's cool to talk about, but I think well, like the common thread between those things is just like having an interview that's different. I like
Hmm. Yeah.
I don't consider myself to be like, oh, like studying interviewing so hard that I'm going to be one of the best interviewers, but I always want to say something like different or reach a place that will teach the listener about a different skill set they might not have thought about. And which is why I don't hear a lot of people talking about interviewing, and that's like another reason I wanted to dive a little bit into it. I mean, like the last thing I
Yeah.
wanted to say about interviewing was who's your favorite, maybe like not just one, but who are your favorite most influential interviewers that you listen to?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, that's a really good question. You know, I actually weirdly like, because I don't know if he's like, I don't know. I would have to say Letterman is someone like that. I kind of like his interviewing style because it's very like everyone can kind of relate to him because he doesn't like try to be an expert.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's just like really, he's more of a fan. Mark Maron's kind of like that too. I
Yeah.
like Mark. I like listening to Mark Maron because he isn't. He's kind of a normal guy, but he know. But in those two, and then like you can't really deny Howard Stern, I guess.
Oh, of
You know,
course.
it's like Howard Stern is like somebody who is just he's him. You know what I mean? It's like it's his. And the only thing with Howard Stern is it's he's a good interviewer, but it like a lot of his personality is in all of it, which I also like. So I
Yeah.
would say like the three of them are the two people that I've listened to the most. You know,
Yeah.
and I probably have drawn certain things from them. But yeah, I'd say like Mark Maron's podcast was the first one that I started really listening to a lot. I also just loved his diversity of guests, which is
Yeah.
something that I aspire to as well. That I'd like to start getting, you know, politicians and artists and comedians and stuff like that beyond just music someday.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I love all that kind of stuff. I'm a big comedy fan, which I'm going to get to in a few. I do want to talk about that. But just before we leave the interviewing subject, I mean, Questlove has got to be one of my favorite interviewers. Like I said, he's got such an encyclopedic amount of knowledge.
Yeah.
But my favorite person to listen to interviews from is Nardwar. Are you familiar with him?
Oh yeah, I actually have. I don't not very familiar, but I just saw the one where he like interviews J. Cole. The
Oh,
rapper.
yeah.
That one was good.
I feel like he's got the most unique style, like the same way a lot of like
Yeah.
artists
I should
build
probably
it.
watch some other interviews from him.
He like I don't know if I could ever do research as in depth as him and get the crazy kind of responses he gets, but every time I
Yeah.
watch his interviews, I mean it's like he's built a vocabulary and style to the interviews, and like the character that he plays just fits it all so well, and I think he's done something with interviewing that I haven't seen anyone else do. But that, just for me, that's like what gets me thinking about like who does it the best, and definitely the names you listed, like Mark Maron is one of my favorites also.
Yeah, because I like that Mark Maron will kind of like bring it into like the normal world. Like he'll get someone who's has a very like specific talent, but he'll kind of like bring it into scope so that anyone can understand it, but also doesn't dumb it down completely,
Yeah,
which I think is important to do. You know, my podcast does get very like technical at times, but I try to make it something that someone that's not a musician can also enjoy. That's always something I'm trying to think about.
yeah,
Um,
same.
you know,
Now, I mostly have musicians on the podcast, but I also have some comedians on too, and I love to ask them about what they're into musically. But for the musicians, I'm a huge stand-up nerd, and I always love to know, what are you most into when it comes to stand-up comedy or just comedy in general?
yeah. I mean, some of them are obvious. I mean, I'm a Chappelle fan.
Of course, yeah.
I went and
He's my
I went and
favorite.
saw him last year. I got to work with him back in the day on Talib Kweli's album. I got to kind of like be around him when he was sketching out some of the initial concepts for the Chappelle show, which is like such a cool experience. So I'm a huge fan of him. And this might be a little bit down the middle, but my wife introduced me to Sebastian Maniscalco recently.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just really, I mean, it's not like politically profound by any means, but he just makes me laugh my head off. So like, and I didn't really know about him. Turns out he's a huge deal. But it's just like, if I just want to like laugh and just be, I really like him. But then like, trying to think of some other, I mean, I grew up on like Richard Pryor,
Yeah,
that was,
yeah, of course.
and Eddie Murphy and all the classics. But I don't know. I'm always kind of like digging for new stuff. So if you have any other people that I should check out, let me know.
Yeah, well, there's a few guys that I really love on the new season of the stand-ups on Netflix, like Mark.
Yeah, I actually just watched one episode of that.
Brian Simpson, I think, might be the first guy on that, and I was
That
gonna
maybe is who I saw. Yeah, I can't remember his name, but I dug it.
Yeah,
I should
he's
dig into
so
that
good.
show more.
And Mark Normand is another one who's got a great half hour on that and a great hour he did last year. But my biggest recommendation for a lot of people is there's a show Kill Tony.
Okay.
It's like a live podcast where they have a comedian on for their panel, with the hosts Tony Hinchcliffe and Brian Redband, and they have a band, and they pull random names to come do 1 minute stand up sets, like local
Wow.
comedians and people from the audience. It's
Oh,
like
cool.
one of the most unique, like best running formats I've ever seen to a show. And it's
Cool.
like it,
Cool. I'll check that out.
yeah. Kill Tony for the listeners. Great show.
Kill Tony. Okay, I'll check that
But
out.
as far as music goes, is there any musicians who have branched into comedy a lot in a way that you like, or do you generally like music that's more on the serious side?
That's a good question. I actually was with an artist this morning named Wax, who's a guy that I've been working with for years, who's a rapper, but also does comedy. And I think he marries it pretty well in his music. So if people haven't heard of him, Wax, you can
Wait,
find him on
is it Wax
whatever.
from the Brilliant Idiots?
No, I
Okay,
don't
okay, no.
think so. Is there another Wax? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. With
Um,
yeah, there's a podcast with Andrew Schultz and Charlemagne the God, and they have a guy on there named Wax.
oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Uh,
No, he's been around for a minute. He's got a lot of music online that you can find and YouTubes and various things. But he's really clever with how he kind of like sneaks it all. He like combines it. Um, I
yeah.
mean, I always, I grew up on Weird Al. I actually got to meet
Yeah.
Weird Al, like what, a few months back, which was like, I didn't realize like how starstruck I was going to be. But I grew up on that.
Yeah,
But
my
yeah,
older
I don't know.
brother's
I
a big
can't
fan.
say that there's been that many like comedy music combinations that have like won me over yet.
Yeah, it's a weird
But
thing. I generally like my music and comedy pretty separate.
yeah, me too. Generally,
I feel like it's a different mood. Like I don't usually want things to be super silly. But that being said, one of my
yeah.
favorite artists of all time is Frank Zappa, and
Right,
and
right.
his sense of humor is so like quirky and odd. But I don't know, it fits into like it's almost its own genre when you put it all together.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I actually just watched the Zappa documentary,
Oh, I
which
still gotta
kind of
watch
like
that.
made me like him and hate him at the same time.
Yeah.
Not hate. I mean, hate's a bad word. But I've never been like the biggest Zappa fan. I think for that reason, because like the comedy throws me off. So
Yeah.
maybe I do like it separate, and like that kind of throws me off from Fish too. Like, I'm I'm kind of a deadhead. I was like a closet deadhead for so long, and then in more recent years, like I started playing with Phil Lesh, and people started being like, "Well, you must love Fish," And I think Trey's an amazing guitar player, but the songwriting I just couldn't gel with it because it was too. At least the songs I heard were like so silly that it just didn't hit me right, And so I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe I do like them separate.
Yeah, a lot of people tell me I'd like Fish, but I never got as much into them. But they say because I like Zappa. That's
Yeah, because
something.
there is a lot of Zappa in Fish, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I don't know. I'm not super familiar. I gotta look more into it.
yeah.
But I do gotta wrap up shortly. But one of the last things I wanted to ask your opinion on was obviously you've got a lot of experience working with uh, amazing funk and hip hop rhythm players as well as rappers and producers and doing your own production. Who would you say has changed your mind the most as a producer when it comes to like what's rhythmically possible or what constitutes a good groove?
Definitely Jay Dilla. I mean, I think anyone in modern production has to pay attention to like what he did to rhythm.
Yeah,
He kind of changed how we feel things. I also think that D'Angelo was a part of that too. And if you listen to my podcast with Questlove, he talks about how they were doing the same. Like everyone thinks, oh, Dilla completely influenced D'Angelo, but it was actually D'Angelo was also doing that. So
yeah,
it's hard to say what came first, but they influenced each other for sure. But yeah, I think that changed like how we feel things rhythmically. But you know, I mean, I think there's so many. I mean, James Brown really changed the entire world in terms of like funk. There would be no funk,
Yeah.
you know, music. I mean, there was funky music, but there was no funk music before. So, um, you know, I mean, there's a lot of others in that were, I could say, influence how I think about rhythm in smaller ways. But if you want to go broad strokes, I would say James Brown and Dilla.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. I mean, I know Dilla has so much trademark stuff, such an iconic sound that people go to a lot in that conversation. For me personally, Tribe Called Quest and Pete Rock, I think are particularly groovy, but I definitely in a more subtle way. I think Dilla has this very like, kind of like I was saying with Zappa, in the smaller way, he's kind of like creating his own sound, like almost bordering on a genre, just in how specific he'll get about certain things. But I do feel like producers like that have just kind of changed the way I feel like musicians outside of hip hop think about rhythm.
Yeah,
Because like someone like RZA, who was
yeah,
like,
he's also a good example.
yeah, there's like some almost like loops that almost feel jerky, but are like at the same time creating like a subtle, are like putting certain accents that aren't lining up with regular notation into the psyche of all like musicians of this generation. So I feel like as hip hop has gone on, as electronic production has gone on, it's kind of led us to open up to play rhythms totally outside of just like what's written on notation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's just another thing I like to touch on, especially with producers. Now, just to wrap up the show, I want to know what should people be looking out for as far as your releases go, and your tours, and where should they look out for you online?
Yeah, you can find all of my kind of dates and everything at erickrasno.com, ERICKRASNO. And I think most of my like Instagram is just at Eric Krasno. And we go out on tour in February. We leave on our February tour starts in Colorado, then goes through up to the Northwest and then down the West Coast, California. Then we're on the East Coast. I know we're in upstate New York.
Yep,
Um,
Woodstock and Cohoes, I saw.
yeah, yeah, we'll both be near you, and we're at Brooklyn Ball. All of that's in May. So,
Awesome.
yeah, people on the East Coast, just go check out all the tour dates, erickrasno.com. And yeah, it's all up
Yeah.
there. And
Oh,
yeah, the album is out February 4th, so it's out.
yeah, it's already out
And
now.
it's out.
And
And yeah, I've got a lot of other music kind of coming out throughout the year, but yeah, the Always album is what I'm kind of promoting and doing at the moment. And I've got my new band. It's called The Assembly, and really great players, really great singers in the band. We're also touring with Sun Little, who's one of my favorite kind of current singer artists. And it'll be a really cool show. We're going to collaborate together, and we're kind of sharing the same band. It's going to be like a kind of a review kind of show. So highly recommend people come out and check us out.
awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.